team has been doing at NC State, looking at nature-based solutions or natural infrastructure to try to mitigate some flooding in eastern North Carolina. I've had a long career with restoration, in particular stream restoration, and so really wanted to explore this idea of how we could use these natural systems we've been restoring or enhancing or creating to help with flood mitigation, because since Hurricane Floyd in 2016, we've just been hit with a lot of storms, and it's not going to ease up, I don't believe. So this is kind of the new future. I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this work, Dan Line and Jack Kirky Fox. They're in the department here in Bio and Ag Engineering, and they do all the heavy lifting on the modeling and analysis. I'm the kind of idea person that helps put this together. So everything I'm presenting is really due to a lot of their hard work. And also all the logos on the bottom to acknowledge a lot of the partners we've had, with either partners in kind of looking at natural infrastructure or the funding and evaluating some of the things I'm going to share with you today. I want to acknowledge all the people because this is not just my work that I'm going to be presenting. So as I mentioned, NC State in general, we have through our ecological restoration program and the College of Natural Resources, where we know a lot about farming, wetland, stream restoration, and reforestation practices. So we wanted to know how we might be able to mitigate flooding, but also to maximize other benefits of these types of natural systems. That's why the whole focus on nature-based solutions. Our approach has been to kind of look at what opportunity is out there on the landscape, and then we do a whole lot of modeling of the watershed or the hydrology. And then we also do a lot of river hydraulics. So once that water gets into the river, we have to have a hydraulic model to evaluate kind of where that water goes and where it floods. And we've also done water quality benefit analysis and modeling, and we've partnered with others to look at cost and benefits of these different types of approaches. Some of the first work we did was funded by the Environmental Defense Fund. We looked at 2 creeks in Goldsboro. We did a small project for them. One of the creeks we looked at is called Big Ditch. This is a very armored, channelized urban stream, as Dave was talking about with Rocky Branch. This one's even worse than Rocky Branch because a lot of it's just lined with this concrete, and it's kind of straitjacketed in. It's a small watershed of about 3 square miles, almost all developed. It has a lot of road crossings over top this creek, and many of those are undersized. 16 of these road crossings are overtopped in as little as the 10-year storm, which, Hurricane Matthew is about a 100-year. So there's a lot of issues with flooding of the roadways here. So we decided to kind of look at both this gray infrastructure and the green infrastructure and kind of compare and contrast the benefits of, well, what if I did the typical civil engineering approach versus more of the ecological engineering approach? And I'm going to kind of cut to the chase on this analysis. But what we looked at is those things individually and combined. So for the ecological approach, we said, well, what if we took this channel and we reconfigured it in a more natural way to have a channel and a floodplain? So we excavated out all this area and made a much wider floodway, and we could meander the stream and plant those trees, all the types of things like we've done in other stream restoration. Well, then we looked at all these crossings, and many of them, as I said, undersized. And we said, we've got a lot of duplicate crossings. Every single block in these neighborhoods has a crossing of the stream. So we said, how about we take out these redundant crossings, and then the other crossings that are at more the important roadways, what if we enlarge those because they are just too small, they cause backwater, and they cause flooding? And so what we found is that if we did one thing, if we did that kind of just engineering approach of the roadways, we had very limited benefit. And if we did just the restoration of getting the floodway wider, we still had flooding problems because of the backwater from the culverts. So you actually have to do both things to achieve the benefits, the flood mitigation benefits. And this is the hydraulic model. It actually reads from right to left, moving downstream. So it's opposite of what you would think. So the water's this way. So we have in blue here the water surface profile existing. So we can see how these roads back up water. And when we did that combined approach, here's the red line of really bringing that floodwater way down. So it took both things to address the gray infrastructure and green infrastructure to reduce flooding in this watershed. And this shows the kind of footprint of that, with the blue being existing and with our combined kind of resilient approach of getting rid of redundant crossings, expanding the floodway. And this would require buyout of structures out of the flooding. So in other words, we have to do a lot of things to actually mitigate flooding. There's no one silver bullet. It's a combination approach that is necessary. And natural infrastructure is an element of that approach in this case. So again, this would require buyout of the structures. This shows you that floodway where it would be expanded and the structures that would need to be bought out in order to address that, which is something we do a lot of. We also looked at Stony Creek, which is also in Goldsboro. And this watershed is a larger watershed. It's about 23 square miles. And it has a unique situation where the upper portion of the watershed is mostly agriculture, and the bottom is urbanized. And this is where we have flooding problems. In fact, the road near the hospital actually floods, which is very problematic during these severe events. So it's about 43% developed. And we wanted to look at, instead of increasing floodway, could we potentially store water in the watershed and slow that water down or prevent some of that flooding downstream? So we looked at 3 different scenarios of what we would do. So we looked at storage and retention. So we looked at creating these areas. I have these blue hatch areas in the watershed where it is ag land, and you would put a berm and have a structure there that you would hold water back only in big storms. So any given just typical rainfall, this would operate like the normal farm. But when we're getting a very big event, a 25, 50, 100-year storm, they would have to close off the opening in these berms and hold water for anywhere from 1 to 3 or 4 days, depending on the kind of timing of flow in the watershed. So we had about 10% of the watershed what we found suitable for this storage. Then we also looked at reforestation. Like, what if we converted these croplands to timber instead? And then we looked at the combined approach of those. So this, of course, was theoretical. We showed, to get the full benefits of reforestation, it's not immediate, right? It takes a while for your timber to grow. And so individually, we found benefits of both the storage and reforestation, but in combination, we found a 28% reduction in peak flow, even for the 500-year storm event. So that was a substantial reduction. Now, granted, we're taking 30% of the watershed and making some serious changes there, but by doing this natural infrastructure, we found you could have significant reductions in peak flows during very large events, because most of our flooding problems happen at about the 100-year event or above, like when we're approaching those large events. So this led us to a bigger project that we have recently completed this year that was funded by the NC Policy Collaboratory, where we decided to look at the Middle Neuse Basin, because the Neuse has really been plagued by a lot of flooding. So this is a much bigger area. There's a lot of, modeling work to be done. So we did it kind of in a systematic way, where what we did is we picked 3 sub-basins within the watershed, the Little River in the kind of more of the Piedmont zone, and we looked at 2 coastal plain basins, the Hunter Swamp and Bear Creek. And we did very intense modeling, looking at opportunity again, where we could put these things, and then doing that hydrology and and water quality modeling in this case, and looked at reductions. And then what we learned, we then extrapolated to the other subbasins in the Middle Neuse. Now, we did not focus in the upper part of the Neuse River because this is all controlled by the Falls Lake Dam. So that's already got flood control benefits for all that area. And then we stopped at the point of Kinston for our flooding analysis and looking at the watershed. So we did a lot of the things I see other people do, where we, take all these GIS layers of soil, slope, land use, and kind of overlaid these and said, hey, these are the areas that we should be able to do natural infrastructure. And we focused on wetlands, stream restoration. We were looking at this idea of water farming that I'm going to talk about. But then we went out and kind of ground truthed over 240 sites in these sub watersheds and said, is this site really a good place for it? When we got to some of the locations, we're like, yeah, this would be great for this, but other locations like, this is really too steep, or there's would flood this road, or other things that we found. So we did a lot of refinement of our GIS, looking at aerial photos and from those field ground truthing trips. And what we did is to be able to really isolate where it could be. We found that you have to limit slope to about 1%, because when you're trying to hold water somewhere, that you need to minimize the height and frequency of berms for that. And so if you start getting into very big berms, it's very expensive and would be kind of high hazard structures. We put buffers on roads and structures and hog waste lagoons, and we had to remove a lot of small parcels because you wouldn't want just spotty, tiny practices. You want more large practices to be able to have real benefit. So here's some kind of examples where we looked at actually what's going on these sites and refined our GIS analysis process. So here on this Nahunta Swamp watershed, the yellow were all the areas that were pre-identified in round one. And then the red is where we actually, after that refinement process, these are the only areas we looked at for water farming, for example. And I really want to stress that, because I see a lot of this work where people do this theoretical site analysis, and it really needs more detail than that to kind of get to the nuts and bolts of it. So I've said this term water farming. Basically, that's engineered systems that are designed to retain and slowly release water in order to try to reduce downstream flooding. This has been applied in Florida. They have where very flat farm areas, they build a berm around it. They have an outlet control structure. And what they want to do there is they've really been focused on nutrient retention. They're wanting to keep the nutrients there, let them be uptake before they're released to waterways. But this has also been done for flood control. And so we found that, again, those relatively flat slopes, less than around 1.1%, where no structures, and what we looked at contiguous areas of at least 20 acres to have a substantial benefit for that. So to really get at what it would take to do water farming, we took several of the sites we identified, and we used the digital elevation model data, and we were like, where would you need a berm? So we actually identified the kind of lower parts of these fields. So, High Point, it's draining this way, it's draining this way, and where we would need outlet structures on existing ditches and that. And that helped us to get a handle on how much water would you actually store. And it also helped us with costing of what this would take. So in other words, for how many acre feet of water, what's the berm length and height I'm going to need? How many water control structures am I going to need? And getting at some of the cost of these elements. So again, these water farms, these structures would be here. They would be open all the time. The water would flow like normal unless we are expecting a big event. So these are managed systems. So you're not just flooding cropland on any old storm. You're only going to flood that land temporarily when you have one of these large events of concern. So here's in yellow, the Bear Creek areas that were identified in yellow. And in Nahunta, I've already showed you some of those. There's the yellow is where we found suitable areas with all that criteria in mind. And then we extrapolated what we learned to estimate the percentage for the other subbasins. So we found about 5% in Hunta, about 5% of the watershed in Bear Creek, but only about 1.1% in the Middle Neuse, because in the upper part of the basin, Little River and these other basins, they're too steep. The land slopes would not really be suitable for this because you'd have to have lots and lots of berms and they would get very high. Okay, so we also looked at something called flood storage wetlands. We're looking at wetlands to retain water and slowly release it. Eastern North Carolina, we've done a lot of wetlands restoration work. This is one of the ones I think that BA was involved in with the Coastal Federation. And with these projects, typically they just plug ditches, create microtopography, and plant the area. This is not what we're talking about, because these areas would be pretty full of water by the time you get a short amount of rain. They're already flooded. So we're looking at constructing a feature that would actually have a berm, an outlet, and it's sitting there with just a small amount of water for a wetland pre the storm, but it's got a storage component. It's going to have to hold water and release it slowly in order to have downstream benefits for flood mitigation. So we looked at these flood storage wetlands. Here's some renderings the College of Design created, where we may take an ag ditch and convert it to this, but it would have to have some structures within it. It could even be a stream restoration project that then had a structure to hold more water on the floodplain of that stream restoration. So in profile, we would see where it is a wetland with low water, it would have to have a pipe that would, and an earthen embankment, so that the water fills this wetland and it drains out more slowly than it would have if it was just the ag ditch that existed before. So that helped us to refine the GIS data again, because we did this initial analysis of where's were wetlands before. And so we ended up looking at where we had drainage ditches that would drain at least 35 acres of land. So you don't want it on your main stream channel. It needs to be kind of on blue line or smaller channels, unnamed reaches. And that these were sized then the wetland itself to be about 10% of the drainage area. So you had to do that to get enough storage, hold that water enough. So here's an example of the types of ditches in red. Here's the drainage area to each of those ditches. And then on the right, this shows you the wetland actually being sized in that area. And again, we looked at the size of these wetlands, what type of excavation would be needed, and quantities and cost for this as well. So here in Bear Creek shows you the wetlands in red, and then in blue you can see the amount of land area that the flow from that would be controlled by those wetland structures. And then here's Nahunta Swamp. You can see again, the red wetlands with the blue drainage areas to them. So again, when we looked at the extrapolating our GIS process for identifying areas, we have very little to almost no opportunity in the upper part of the basin, again, because there's not a lot of undeveloped land or that's not steeper land. So most of our opportunity was concentrated in the lower part of the basin. We found about 1.5% in Little River, 12% of Nahunta Swamp, 21% of Bear Creek. So a lot of opportunity down here in these lower basins, but only about 5.7% for the full Middle Neuse Basin on average. We looked at reforestation opportunity as well, because the Stony Creek example. And what we found, we focused on low productivity cropland. There's actually a layer that comes out of the National Commodity Crop Productivity Index, and we used that areas with a score of less than 0.33 and identified those areas that were touching or overlaying with that lower index. We found a lot of opportunity in the lower part of Bear Creek Basin. We found very little opportunity in Nahunta. Most of the crop productivity numbers are very high for that watershed. So there was just nothing you want to take out of production in that watershed. And we found a fair amount of opportunity in the Little River. So this is something more for the upper part of the Middle Neuse is an opportunity. So then you can see that distribution again, that's very relevant to where it's open land and it's not a high productivity cropland. So we had about 8.4% in the full Middle Neuse, which is a pretty substantial amount of the Neuse Basin that could be converted to forestry. So then we built a very, we obtained a very detailed model that was developed by AECOM for North Carolina Emergency Management for the Neuse River. And then we modified this model to show the effect of our natural infrastructure practices throughout the watershed. So we did the very detailed models for Bear Creek and Nahunta and Little River, and then took that big AECOM model of the full Middle Neuse and then tweaked it to represent the findings we had from those smaller basins. So here's an example of the very detailed model we built for Bear Creek. You can see all the many elements that have to be built in that to show storage and channel flow elements. So then we inserted those practices into the model using a variety of techniques, everything from, as I said, storage elements to modifying runoff relationships. And so with Nahunta Swamp, here's a summary of the percent of that watershed that's in natural infrastructure practices. Then we looked at each one of these individually. So this is the calibrated model. We actually had to calibrate. These basins were chosen because they have a USGS gauge at the bottom that we could calibrate our flows before we ever start changing anything in the watershed. So here we are with reforestation. We have only a 0.6% peak flow reduction in a Hurricane Matthew event. With water farming, we have 7.7%, wetlands 8.9%, and then when we combined water farming and wetlands, we got 13.6% peak flow reduction for Hurricane Matthew at the outlet of this Nahunta watershed. That would equate to about less than a half a foot of elevation change in the river flow itself at the outlet of Nahunta. I'm not talking about the Neuse, I'm talking about in the Nahunta swamp here at this point. And so we can look at that reduction. Here's the inundation map of a 100-year storm, not Matthew. If we look at the 100-year storm, which they're very close in scale, the Matthew and the 100-year 1% annual chance. So we can see that when you're in one of these flooding events, here's the channel, here's the floodplain of Nahunta Swamp. And when above a 25-year storm, you're pretty much out of channel all the way in the floodplain. So even if you reduce that by 10, 13%, the flow, we can see that that water is already well spread out. So that percent comes down. It doesn't have a huge change in the footprint of this flooding, but it is a change in the elevation of that flooding. So for Bear Creek, here's the summary of the potential we found. Again, wetland and reforestation potential very high in this watershed. And you can see that the percentages really increasing with that combined percentages reaching over 20% reduction in peak flow for this watershed. So a lot of opportunity here. That would equate to about a 1 foot drop in the water level of that. But again, I just want to point out that water, even with that reduction, is well out into the floodplain. So it doesn't really change a lot of the footprint of the flooding. It does bring the water down in these storms. So it's more of changing the elevation of that where that water is at. And we saw a lot of distribution in the reductions, that it was not uniform. And it depends on kind of the density and location of where you are in the watershed, and the location of the watershed and the density and location of the NI, or the natural infrastructure in that watershed. So in some areas here, we found up to 40% reductions in flow, again, depending on kind of the scale of that creek and how much natural infrastructure and the placement of that. So again, benefits could be very high in localized areas, but they tend to be diminished as we get further down the main reach of these watersheds. So then we took everything we knew and we did an extrapolation process, which I'm saying in one word, which was a very difficult process, to take what we learned in those 3 watersheds and pull it out to those others and simulate the full metal noose on that bigger model we got from AECOM. So we wanted to look at this total change in the watershed. And so here we can see our peak flow reductions, where we have, very good reductions in peak flow for Hurricane Matthew down in the lower part of the basin. And that's because that's where a lot of our practices, the opportunity existed. We had very minimal opportunity up in the upper part, so just not a lot of change in that peak flow in the upper part of the watershed. We then looked at the communities down the river of Smithfield, Goldsboro, and Kinston to see what type of reductions we'd see. Once we looked at those peak flows, we looked at that in the hydraulic model on the river and see what does this mean to the main river segment and the communities that flood along it. So at Smithfield, we saw really no change. Here's our calibrated model. Here's reforestation in red, water farming plus wetlands in orange, and then everything, the purple's the full combined. So we really saw no reduction in Smithfield because again, the upper part, we just don't have a lot of opportunity, and Smithfield's up there high in the Neuse Basin. Whereas Goldsboro, we saw up to about 4.4% reduction in the peak flow for Hurricane Matthew, and down at Kinston, about 5.3% for that combined effect of all the measures installed in the Middle Neuse Basin. So why, what would that mean? So it's still, again, it's just going to lower that water. If we look at the Neuse River at Kinston, here's the kind of 2 openings of the river, and we have the whole floodplain of that. Even if this Hurricane Matthew is in blue there, even if we lowered the water by 1 foot, again, it's not going to change the footprint of that flooding. Again, it's going to lower that water surface. And that's just the nature. When you're, again, at a 25-year storm or above, that's the natural function, that you have a channel, you have a floodplain, water spills out of that channel onto the floodplain. That's what we want. That's the natural process. So it'd only be bringing the water down some degree for that. So the bottom line is structures that are in the 100-year floodplain, we're not going to eliminate the risk to those. Rather, we're only going to, bring it down. So maybe you're standing in a little less water in that floodplain, but you're going to still have water in your floodplain. And so I want to make that message very strong. And I think that's one we need to convey over and over to the public. And we're seeing more frequent severe events that are going to fill that 100-year floodplain. But even though that seems like not much, the 1/2 foot reduction, we looked at the damage reduction to those communities at different levels of storm return intervals, from the 25, the 50, the 100, and the 500-year. We use the North Carolina Emergency Management has the Feynman tool that you can look at actual every 1/2 foot, how much damage occurs. So we use those values. And what we saw, again, we focused on Goldsboro and Kinston because remember, Smithfield had no reductions in flow. And we could see that we had between 7 and 21% reductions for these various return interval storms, with the greatest reductions for about the 50-year storm. That size storm would be reducing damages the most with that change in water surface elevation we'd get for those storms. So then we did water quality modeling, very detailed in the Hunter and Bear, where we had a lot of opportunity. And so we simulated all these practices. First, we built the models and we calibrated those to known water quality sampling by USGS. And then we inserted these natural infrastructure practices. And what we found this is Bear Creek, and as an example in this, we used a model called SWAT for that. We found about 15% reductions in total nitrogen and total phosphorus in Bear Creek. Very good, because remember, Bear Creek had a lot of opportunity for the wetlands and reforestation. Little River, with only 6% of that watershed being converted to forest, we found about 12% and 17% respectively reductions in TN and TP. So that was very encouraging information. This just shows you the TN, TP, and sediment as well for the three watersheds. We have Nahunta on the left, Bear Creek in the middle, and Little River on the right, and we have reforestation, the wetland, and the combined practices. So you can see some of these reduction numbers, fairly significant numbers, and the sediment reaching very high for, in particular for Bear Creek, because a lot of that would be the placement where some of those structures were located, some of the natural infrastructure. So these were good, very encouraging numbers on pollutant reduction. And in fact, we found when we looked at the states crediting for just nitrogen credit, we didn't look at phosphorus and sediment because there's no monetary credits. And we looked at the value of that these numbers for the credit over the time period would cover about 23% of the construction costs for the wetlands themselves. So even though it's a really big expense to build these flood control wetlands, the water quality benefit would cover about a quarter of that cost estimated. We did a lot of other detailed economic analysis working with our team partners for this collaboratory funded project, including UNC Chapel Hill and the Soil and Water Conservation Foundation. We looked at many different aspects of economics. We evaluated what type of leasing and purchase agreements would be, plausible with landowners. So they actually met with landowners, did this costing survey with them, and kind of came back, would they be open to it? What type of agreements would they be willing to enter into? What requirements would they have? We looked at direct cost of the actual infrastructure, and we did a lot of that work in the BAE because we have experience with building wetlands and streams and berms and structures and these types of things. So we kind of looked at overall cost. For implementation, the NC State Forestry Department looked at kind of cost and investment returns for landowners and what numbers would work for an individual landowner if they converted land to forestry, if they converted it to these practices. We did a lot of evaluation of spending pathways to say if we put this money, where we looked at past projects of stream and wetland restoration and say, where is the money spent? If we have a $1 million stream or wetland restoration, what did that money go to? So we got the cost estimates, bid tabulations from a lot of past projects. We again estimated those reductions down the river for those storms and estimated water quality benefits. And then UNC Chapel Hill did kind of direct economic and employment impacts and indirect multipliers. So if you put $1 out there for a wetland construction project, where does that go in our local economy? What is the kind of benefit of that, spending that money and stimulating other things within that local area? And so this table has a lot of information. I'm going to just briefly go through some of this and explain. But here it summarizes how much acreage for the practices we identified, what percent of the basin that was, and what the cost would be to implement. So we're looking at $726 million to implement everything we identified in the basin. So that's a lot. We look at the cost per acre of the practices. Wetlands are very high because of the excavation, the berm, the structure for that, but it does have water storage potential that's 3 or more times greater than the water farming and the afforestation. We looked at the wetlands have a high cost per acre foot of water stored. But then we also looked at what if we spend that money? The direct jobs created would be about over 1,600 jobs. Then we have the indirect multipliers. So these would be jobs created in other industries for each job associated with the infrastructure project. And that's reaching almost 9,000 jobs. If we looked at the money we spend, the direct economic impacts would be about equal, $791 million. So for every dollar we spend, we're getting that back in our kind of benefits to our local economy. And then if we look at the multipliers, kind of that spillover effect where it stimulates other industries and spending, that we have about over a double return on that investment, reaching as high as on the wetlands of 2.4 for that. So it's not just, we don't just throw the money out the window and not feel the benefits of that. I want to wrap up my last few minutes here, kind of just talking about more comprehensively of flood mitigation. I've got just a few slides here that I want to share an example of. This is Grand Forks, North Dakota. I've selected it because it has a fairly small population of only about 57,000. As you know, in Eastern North Carolina, we don't have huge communities. Other than Wilmington, we have a lot of small communities that are really experiencing a lot of flooding, a lot of problems. So in 1997, Grand Forks had huge flooding. They actually had a fire at the same time. So it was a pretty tough time for them ahead of some of our recent flooding. And so they took an aggressive plan where they wanted to buy out repetitive lost properties. So they removed 50 homes from in the floodplain. They also had some things they just could not move. So they built these protective flood wall kind of levee systems near their downtown area where it's like was not possible to do anything about it. And they implemented, instead of just abandoning this floodway, they took and converted it into a park and greenway system, and they programmed it for activity. They didn't just build it and say, all right, well, let's see what people do. They actually had activities there, boating, events, even cross-country skiing in this park, where they had all these events that stimulated the economy. So they didn't just pay this money out. They said, all right, we're going to convert this to give this area back to the river, and then try to make this area benefit our community. And this was very successful program that they have. So this shows the kind of park, the greenway system, and they have, again, a lot of events out here. I also kind of want to feature in the Netherlands. They've been doing, they are water management experts, right? They deal with challenging water situation, and they've realized they've got to do things a little different. And they have a new program called Room for the River, where they are moving some of their levees back. They're changing some of these bridges, expanding floodplains to create more area for the river itself instead of leaving it straitjacketed. And that's the point. The floodplain is really the highest and best use of the floodplain is for water, for storage of water during extreme events. We need to remember that. So just a few kind of things to consider, take-home messages. Our communities, they need financial and technical assistance. Some of these small communities, they don't even have an engineering staff there to do any of this type of analysis. So anywhere we can bring to bear technical expertise, scientists, people that have know-how to help, I think that's very valuable through all phases of evaluation, whether it's analysis, planning, design, implementation. Innovative solutions are going to be key. Multi-prong approaches. Like I said, in most of these things we looked at, it's not one thing that resolves it. So you can't just go in as I'm the civil engineer looking at bridges and roads. I'm the ecological engineer. I only care about wetlands. We have to integrate our solutions, and we have to work with those people that are doing buyout and economic development in communities and know how to get grants and things of this nature. Better communicating risk to the public. They need to understand more about flooding, where it floods, why we have floodplains, what that is, and a little bit more. Yes, 1% annual chance. Any given year, you have a 1% chance of that 100-year floodplain flooding. Over a 30-year period, that's 26% chance. So if you had your home out there, which is about 30-year mortgage, you don't want a 26% chance of it flooding. So we've got to keep these structures out of the floodplain. So those structures that are there that are getting repeated flooding, we need to get them out. So we're doing our state has done buyout, and they continue to do that, and I applaud that. I think buyout and elevation are really important, and we don't stop that. We've got to identify where are the safe places for people to be. Where are the best places to develop, and show this to these communities, keep them out of these waterways because water always wins. Again, the most important use of our floodplains is storing water, and that it's important that we recover these floodplains for that. And this can create beneficial opportunities. Some communities say, oh, this is a negative, we're going to lose tax base. We've got to figure out ways that we can keep the community intact and use these areas to provide economic and community social benefits as well. Here's a web page that we have on our Sea Grant website. It has some of our studies, our efforts on there. And so I just want to give you that web link in case you want to see more. We've done a lot of work working with DOT, looking at bridges. We're doing a study now of road washouts to kind of look at practices they can do to better predict where that's going to occur and where they should invest to kind of make different road routes more resilient as well during storm events. So that's all I have. We can open it up to questions if that's okay, Dave.
Wow, thank you, Barbara. That was amazing. So let's give Barbara a round of applause. Thanks so much. Just really impressive sequence of kind of learning, adapting, and just holistic view. So we've got plenty of time for questions.
Barbara, hi, this is Amanda Mueller. And first of all, this was really exciting and I could talk to you about this for days. So I will try to limit my questions and not monopolize the conversation. But one of the first questions I had for you, if I understood your figures correctly, it looked like you were assessing the positive change within each individual watershed. And if that was the case, did you do a cumulative assessment? And what I'm thinking of, right, we talk about the activities in the headwaters and the cumulative activities in the headwaters making a difference for those downstream coastal communities. So I'm curious in your assessment if you looked at that cumulatively so that all of these, if all of the watersheds did those individual impacts, what would be that positive change for those coastal communities that really are seeing the greatest impact from these large events?
Right, and it is cumulative because we put all the practices out there in the model, so they're built in the model, and but we do look at events. So in other words, flooding occurs on an event basis. So that's why in those watersheds we would look at Matthew, and some we would look at Floyd because that was a better data on the calibration for that storm. And we look at also those kind of design storms, the 150, 25-year events, to see where it really makes a difference. So even though we're looking at cumulatively in the watershed, we also look at, in this extreme event, what changes with peak flow. So in other words, the water comes, we have a hydrograph of flow. It looks like this, and it reaches a peak of so many cubic feet of water per second, CFS. So we're looking at how far do we pull that down and the kind of change in that peak, because that peak is what really influences how high the water is in the river and where it is inundating structures in that community. Now with the SWOT modeling for water quality, that's a cumulative long-term, it was, I think, a 20-year simulation of the water quality for that. So that's more long-term. So it kind of depends on what part of it you're looking at. And then for the cost benefit for those, we did some, I didn't even present this. We kind of looked at maybe in the next 30 years, how many storms would you expect to have? And what's this, at each of those events, what's the change in those communities with flooding and all those? So more of a cumulative event that way. I will say that damage reductions isolate to structures. So it doesn't account for, people out of work, lost economy. There's other multipliers. So we did it just very structurally focused. So there's a lot more. We're not really we don't have the software, the training to do the full FEMA-based cost benefit analysis, which is more comprehensive, but I still think they leave out, they don't do any of the environmental benefits and all these other things. And I think we need to get more of that type of work done.
But questions for Barbara? And you can also put questions in the chat. Scott?
Barbara, wonderful presentation. I really appreciate the scale of the analysis and putting it in context as you have. I really appreciate that. I'm wondering if you have thought about the contribution potentially of conservation practices on the landscape, like soil health initiatives, conservation tillage, for example, or cover crops. Would those be a part of the matrix of practices that could increase infiltration? And have you looked at that?
Yes, when we started, we had a list of like 18 practices that included those. And there are many of those that are going to have benefits. However, the benefits tend to be capped at when you start getting in the 25, 50 and above year storm. You have to have a storage element. So we kind of focused more on the extreme events, but most certainly you're going to get some water storage and even potentially other, environmental benefits with those practices, and even crop benefits potentially with those practices. But where we were focusing on these big events that are causing the catastrophic flooding, we isolated it to those practices that I showed you that would really have some substantial storage element. And that also, Scott, that we could model. So it becomes some things we're like, how, that we spent, like I summarized, we extrapolated. When I say that one word, I mean, there was a lot of thought and effort into that kind of extrapolation process. Even with the study watersheds, how we simulate these practices in those models, they're not necessarily built to do those things. So we're almost having to create routines in there that it does this reservoir. You're not putting a pond there, but you're having to create these like a proxy for what you're trying to show the change. So some of it was limited by that as well, but more, a lot of those practices would be overwhelmed when you reach these storms, because when we get a severe event, like Matthew came on the back of another tropical storm, so everything was saturated. So it wouldn't matter in a lot of cases what the practices were, that everything's shedding water at that point.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
More questions?
Barbara, can I ask, with that water farming, and that, is a neat kind of new concept. My background's in wetlands work, so, always thinking of wetlands restoration and storage capacity. But with that water farming, for those parcels that would work, in that realm, did you assess at all what the current habitat or land use is for those water farming areas? And kind of in future thinking, would there be alternative uses, thinking of economic services? Could they serve multiple roles, and thinking of, landowner buy-in and willingness to do that?
I think that's a great question. I mean, and I'm going to kind of, I think that, we kind of siloed our 3 natural infrastructure practices, but they could really be kind of integrated. Even one farm could have, it would need to be tailored to that farm, these practices, which, the state has put money, they put, I think 30 million to division mitigation services and 15 million to land and water fund to kind of start trying to put some of these things out there and develop a plan. So I think it would be very site specific, what works along with not just the kind of waterway, but the topography, the land use, and the landowner kind of preferences and what their kind of future vision. I mean, I don't see why you couldn't have this reforestation with the berms and the water storage, right? So there's a lot of conversation about that. Looking at, we looked at timing, like how long you have to hold the water back. And we know that if you're like in Bear Creek, you could get away with one to 2 days. If you're concerned about the river, then you want 3 to 4 days to really of delay. So you're not holding that water for weeks on end, right? You would be able to open the gate back up and let that water out. Of course, it's a managed system. So I think you could have integration of these things and say they were interested in establishing conservation easement. Maybe they want to do wildlife things. You could still have this potentially this water storage element on it. Now, a lot of the farmers were asked, how much acreage do you have right now that you'd be willing to enroll? And a lot of them had a lot of acreage, because the reality is they are seeing flooding impacts to their farms, even if it's not in a floodplain where it's a lower area of their farm, it holds water and the crops are damaged, or it stays so wet they can't even get in and harvest it. So if they see this as a way they could get a more secure payment, that when their crop was flooded, they would have reimbursement, they'd be able to plant the next year crop, not lose money, that this could be a more secure system for them. So that's why I think they were very open to this kind of concept. They would like to hear more. I think it's time that we maybe do some tests or pilots of this and look at even, they did have concern about, well, if the water's held for 4 days or 5 days on my site, what would be the consequence to soil health? Right. So, there's some questions that need to be answered, but they were not like slam the door and say, no way, we're not doing it. We got a chat question here. Okay, so has it been well received? So we've just started really, presenting this out. I feel like we've gotten a good reception to this. I think some of our team's messages about integrating solutions, that's really coming through loud and clear. Like people are getting that maybe you used one approach before and that is how we went, but people are saying, all right, things are getting worse. We've got to be more creative with our solutions. I think people are understanding that. I will say, like the big ditch example in Goldsboro, when we say we're going to eliminate these redundant crossings, like, whoa, our community's not going to like that. So I've been talking to them about having community meetings and kind of talking about their experiences during flooding and kind of looking at these alternatives and see how they would react to that. So I think the engineering department is kind of making assumptions about how they are going to take it. And, so they're not really going in for big grants yet to try to do this work on Big Ditch, because they want that community buy-in. So I think it's a critical piece. And so I think once these levels, people start, kind of going, well, these are the things that might work. And then we start looking at the places we might want to try them. Then we are going to, we've done the outreach with farmers. I've started presenting a lot of this work to some of the planners, community managers, but then start getting it to the actual, residents near these creeks. And I think if they saw the conversion of say we get rid of this road crossing, you might drive 3 blocks to go around, whoopee-doo. Well, if you have that park in that area, that's going to increase the value rather than an abandoned flooded home. I've seen boarded up homes in neighborhoods that the people have given up. They were flooded 2 or 3 times and like, I'm out. And that's sitting there just abandoned. That's not doing anything for the home values in your community. So we've got to take a hard look at, integrating the buyout, getting the structures out, and what do we do in place of that that's more sensible, more sustainable, and resilient.
Thank you, Barbara. We're almost out of time, but I guess just the second part of Tani's question, really good question, and that is, what do you expect to be the biggest obstacles to implementing these strategies for flood mitigation on a community level?
Yeah, it's getting, as you see, you can't just do one thing here, one thing, a little tiny one here. You're not going to get a benefit. It has to be, we were looking at covering 10, 15% of these watersheds. So it takes a good amount of change to make that a positive impact. And so it's going to take time. It's not going to be overnight. So we can't just build one project and go, it didn't stop flooding, downstream. We've got to recognize that this is going to be a transformation where we're going to really kind of look at our watersheds and say, hey, where would it make sense to do some of these things and start, really building out that infrastructure, that it's not instantaneous change, and small little things aren't going to get a big benefit. So I think that's going to be, we're going to have to kind of turn this big ship this other direction and start, nibbling away at it.
Well, with that, I'd like to, give you another round of applause. You can clap, or let's see if I can put my reaction here. Yeah. So Barbara, that was fantastic. So I really appreciate your time and sharing your expertise. And so thank you everybody for participating, and look forward to seeing you all next Friday.